So the problem that I have with your argument, Lauren Southern, is that when you critique capitalism and you claim that this is some form of capitalism today, it's an erroneous argument. And if you're saying that 99.9% of the people call this system today capitalism, they're as every bit as wrong as you would be. At the end of the day, Lauren, when you speak about capitalism, you are speaking about the free market economy. We do acknowledge there has been a level of interference to some degree or another, especially the 19th century when you talk about the Industrial Revolution. I would argue that things are down to a question of scale, that it's about analysing the difference between when the market's left be to that of government's interference to an extent. Now, there has been the presence of free markets in history. When you talk about history of these giant corporations, etc., they got to the position that they got in because of monopolies through that of the state. I remember watching a similar argument against the whole big tech thing, and it was on Dan Bongino. And Dan Bongino made the argument to state that today's big tech is no different to a monopoly of the John Davis and Rockefeller with Standard Oil, why we need antitrust law legislation. So what's the problem with that argument? There was no robber barons. The likes of John Davis and Rockefeller never held a monopoly. A monopoly by definition means that a company would basically own 100% share of the market, there would be no competition whatsoever, and that they would be able to drive the prices up to shaft the consumer. That didn't happen. Between post-Civil War right up to that of 1900, you continuously seen the consumer price index fall. It was a contradiction of the claims made by Ron Chernow, who tried to claim that the likes of Rockefeller used predatory pricing. There was no predatory pricing. In fact, an example of predatory pricing that was attempted, Herbert Dow's chemical company, and the German cartel tried to use that against Herbert Dow, and it failed miserably. So it cannot result in that of a monopoly. The only way a monopoly can form is basically by restricting productive output, and the only way that you can do that is by going against the free market. In other words, through the use of government's interference. Now, today's economy, this is another thing that I disagree with you on. Economy you have today is a mixed economy. A mixed economy is a mixture between capitalism and socialism. That's not a form of capitalism. There is no late stage capitalism. It's a mixed economy. System involving the mixture between capitalism and socialism, and how you can identify what is capitalism to that of socialism. Capitalism is about leaving the market be to regulate itself. So when you speak about capitalism today, it's being strangled half to death. That's the reason why you have corporatism. It's the very reason why the likes of Google and these giant corporations dominate as they do. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they hold monopolies, however, because you do have the freedom to choose to use things like that of, for example, DuckDuckGo. I do understand your reasonable point, however. There is an issue when it came to the likes of Parler and trying to shut them down and making things difficult for competition to ever enter the market. And again, that's corporatism. And a big reason for why that occurred was to do with government's interference in the first place. And the more and more government interfered, and of course the internet, etc. And you take, for example, YouTube with COPPA, the Child Online Protection Act. You would see, things being brought in, certain regulation, etc. And things became more and more centralised, especially within the social media. There is only one capitalism, Lauren. And capitalism is basically the separation of the economy from government. And that's what it really all boils down to, is individualism and collectivism. You cannot pull capitalism outside of individualism. You just can't do it. And the reason why you can't do it is because collectivism is a word synonymous to the word socialism. You were also incorrect in stating that, of course, communism came after capitalism. Maybe the theory of, communism and the name communism, but what difference is communism to that of what you saw with the tragedy of the commons. The truth is, feudalism basically was more or less the same thing as communism. That's the truth of the matter. I'm sorry to say that, it really was. I mean, what difference was there in practice? You see, what it really all boils down to is collectivism. When you define socialism, it's defined around political centralisation, economic central planning, the collective ownership or control of the means of production, state direction of the economy as a whole. When you look at communism in practice, there really is no difference to that of what you saw with the collectivism of feudalism, with the tragedy of the commons. In fact, it basically was socialism, because you saw the communal ownership of property, the absence of secure private property rights. That was precisely the very reason why the Pilgrims had starved to death in a starving time in, of course, Jamestown in 1607. They would eventually follow that of private property, etc. So I disagree with the idea, socialism came after capitalism, etc. Socialism boils down to collectivism. And when you speak about fascism and Nazism and colonialism, imperialism, they're all forms of socialism. Okay, it didn't live up to the theories of what they believe in, but theories can never be, come above that of practice. The very reasons for why we're in this mess today is not because of capitalism. You confuse me over your position, and I don't know what you support, Lauren. You confuse me because on one side of things, in the critique that you give of capitalism, fair enough, there's nothing wrong with having a critical view and being able to question your own position and whatnot, and I agree. I think that is a reasonable thing to do. And I'm not an anarchist, first and foremost. I'm an anarchist at heart, but I'm a minarchist. You mentioned how in the absence of government, it would somehow lead to this almost like a military, etc. and whatnot. With private security, etc., it's impossible to reach that position. You require the government to reach the position of creating that monopolised, centralised issue. The private security relies upon that of the people. They rely upon the people in order to get a wage. Otherwise, they wouldn't have it. You have to acknowledge the non-aggression principle in that argument. Two other arguments she made. One was on the community, and I think something to do with the culture. It's a flawed argument. And it's a flawed argument because it's a misunderstanding of the market. Take for example this country, Scotland. A strong contingent of people, not because we're living under the mixed economy today, but because people in Scotland are very prideful of their heritage, prideful of their, culture, etc. And that won't go away. If you were to have a free market here in Scotland, and let's say it was brought about tomorrow, well, the issue is the market has to cater for where demand is. So if the demand is in favour of protecting the culture and the heritage, that's what the market is, driven towards. So it's not a case that, capitalism seeks to just overthrow such things because, it's all for the sake of profits. Profits is information that's price signals, and the only way the information of profits can come around is through consumers' demand. If consumers' demand is strongly in favour, that's what capitalism will cater for. The only way capitalism would overthrow such things is if the majority of society supports that position. So in other words, what I'm telling you is that profits isn't just information, as if to say it's an obstacle or just some surplus in people's pockets. That isn't what profits are. The majority of people in society support protecting their cultural heritage, etc. So capitalism caters for that. It's not against it. The other thing you mentioned about that to do with the mainstream media and Tinder, etc., and manipulation. The reason why the mainstream media became so problematic, and I can understand you were banned from the United Kingdom and whatnot, and that's all wrong, and that's the fault of socialism, of why you're faced with the problem with the mainstream media. Take for example the BBC that you mentioned about. The BBC's in that position because it's either subsidised, or shall I say it's basically guaranteed. So in other words, the BBC is in the position that it's in. You wouldn't quite say there is a monopoly, because there is, to a varying extent, competition or whatnot. The BBC is guaranteed funding, so it's grew incompetence. And I should do a video explaining on the whole thing to do with the subsidies and the problem with that. Now, you did mention somewhere within your argument, well, as if to say it would just leave people and they would fail and through their own financial responsibility, they would end up losing, and etc, etc. It's almost as if you were arguing in favour of, government subsidies to some varying extent. And the problem I have with that is the history and failure of the government subsidies. They don't work. And it leads to incompetence, it leads to fraud. It's precisely what led to the very problem with what we call the banking crisis of 2008. Surely you would be against that. So I'm not entirely sure. This is why I'm kind of confused over your entire position over capitalism. Another thing that is misconstrued about libertarianism that you need to understand, Lauren. These people who you've been arguing with over a free flow of immigration, I don't think they fully understand libertarianism. Lou Rockwell made a strong argument, and I used to stand in the position of favouring the free flow of immigration. I used to think that that's what libertarianism was about. And I'll tell you the reason why it's not. If all land was privately owned, how then can you have a free flow of immigration? You can't just walk onto anyone's private property and say or do whatever the hell you like. So there's decentralised immigration control. Someone could argue that you could have specific private property designated to allow the free flow of immigration. Okay, fair enough. The argument they have that's logical and reasonable is on the issue to do with the terrorists that you mentioned about, and something to do with the danger that's involved with who's let in. They make the argument in favour of not just the non-aggression principle, but they make the argument also on the fact that they support, gun ownership, people having the right to bear arms to protect themselves, and that is more than understandable, and that is absent from many places today. And I'm not saying it's just down to having gun ownership. You have to have better education. This is why people have become indoctrinated today in many regards, because of state education, even when it comes to the United States of America, based off the Prussian school model. That's what American education's been based off of throughout the whole of the 20th century, unfortunately. Now, no one's saying that capitalism's perfect. It's not a perfect system. No one's saying that you'll ever get rid of rich and poor people completely, or that you'll get rid of exploitation and corruption completely. That isn't the case. And I don't believe anyone who supports capitalism is making that argument. It's complete and utter pish, and it's nonsense, I'm sorry to say, whenever someone says that this system today is late stage capitalism. And if you have a majority of people calling today's system capitalism, they are wrong. It's not as black and white as saying, well, you have to be anarchist in order to support a free market economy, in other words, a capitalist system. And that, I feel, is also where you go wrong. You have had capitalist systems that have been tried and tested in history, and they work the most successfully. The problem over the protectionism, it doesn't work. You take, for example, the antitrust law legislation, as I said. I mean, Dan Bongino makes the argument about that of the monopolisation, as I say. Those giant corporations in the late 19th century, believe it or not, they were the ones who were, benefiting the consumer the most. You cannot call this system today anything remotely at all capitalist. It's anti-capitalist. And let me give you a reason why, Lauren, and why it's so important. Socialists are trying to blame capitalism for the cause of the banking crisis. And if you enable, calling this system today capitalism, you're basically giving them a platform to say, oh, look what capitalism caused. And as a result of the socialism in the mixed economy, it created the problem. And you could watch my video explaining the banking crisis, and I will do a video explaining on the government subsidies and the problems that they create, but that is the main problem. Many people wrongly believe that, deregulation caused the banking crisis, etc. I don't need to go into all of that, but that's the point I'm making. In this mixed economy, unfortunate as it is to say, You cannot have a mixed economy without corporatism, because the culprit for why cronyism exists is socialism. After all, it was the socialists' subsidies, etc., etc. And I know I can acknowledge the argument that you could make about the political entrepreneurs, but that's the fault of the intervention. It's not the fault of a free market for why problems come around, such as the oligopolies, etc., etc. No offence, you misconstrue what capitalism is about. When it comes to profits and losses, they create incentives to make changes. That's the beauty of capitalism. Capitalism's a system of rewarding success and punishing failure. That punishing of failure is not a bad thing. And it sounded like that you were making that argument. You know, for example, you mentioned something about people making wrong decisions in life, such as an alcoholic that makes they end up in the position of becoming an alcoholic because they made a wrong decision in life, and making that a critique of capitalism. Well, that's not a critique of capitalism. That applies for any system. We don't live under a capitalist system, and you've got that problem today. Profits and losses will cater to where consumer demand is. In other words, in this scenario, consumer demand would be in favour of helping people who are in such a position. Capitalism does that through charitable operations, and that's what the moral argument is about. But it doesn't mean every man for himself, and it doesn't mean people are just left be to starve, or, you know, all these myths and baseless claims that are made about capitalism. And sure, people will make mistakes in life. There's no question over that very fact. At least capitalism gives strong opportunity for people to get out of that very mess. And recently, of course, someone had mentioned about the whole thing to do with culture. Like I said, profits and losses are signals. They're not obstacles to getting things that you want. So profits is information gathered from the consumer. So it's consumer demand that drives the market. Therefore, if the market is strongly in favour of protecting their culture, that's what wins out. That's why your argument is incorrect. That it's actually capitalism, it's actually the free market protects your environment, that protects your culture and heritage. And I can give you a small example of what government did. Take this as an example. Just look. What do you think that is? All because of government? Against the consumer, in other words. Basically socialism. They are putting tarmac over the top of ancient Roman roads. Issue with relationships today, that's been created because of indoctrination. That's been created because of the state education system. You know, not just politically dumbing people down, keeping people in the dark, and cultural Marxism that you've been seeing, and why the mainstream media you see today is strongly favoured to the left. That's not the fault of capitalism. I know you were trying to make that a critique of capitalism, but that's not the fault of capitalism. Capitalism is the solution to your problems. And just like Dan Bongino, you know, it's a very, very big mistake to blame capitalism. Very big mistake. I'm not saying he was blaming capitalism. What I'm saying is that he was basically saying that there was this myth of the robber barons, therefore you need protectionism. That's a massive mistake. Massive. This isn't capitalism. This is anti-capitalism. And Ludwig von Mises was absolutely spot on with that. Anyway, hope you enjoy the video, and I hope anybody else takes anything from it. And of course, anybody else, be sure to like the video, share the video, and of course, thank you for watching. Cheers.